So thank you very much for agreeing to have a conversation with me. And as I explained, it's not really like an interview kind of podcast. It's more like a dialogue, and as you can see from the subtitle there, unfolding together. I like that because it relates back to Bohm and the quantum aspect, the wholeness and the unfolding and enfolding, and how processes are really important. So just to say something, my reaching out to you, Katherine, was a few years ago when I was at uni doing the coaching and mentoring postgrad study at Hallam, and I found a lot of the resources we were given quite traditional in not a good way, traditional. And so being a creative, my background is creative, and I was reaching out to people who kind of like made my brain come alight. And you were one of those people. I saw whatever you were doing at the time, and I reached out to you, and we had a couple of brief chats. And so that, fast forward to now, and here we are back on series 2 of the podcast, and the launch just prior to the launch of Dialogue Village, which you've joined. So welcome, and I just wanted to start by possibly asking you a little bit about your background. Is it fair to ask you about coaching, and then maybe weave it into what you're doing now and how that?
Sure. Gosh, it feels like a really big chunk of my life that has been involved in coaching, and yet at the same time I feel as though I'm not exiting coaching as a practice, because obviously I still work as a coach, but in terms of my involvement with the mainstream coaching world and community, that I have had a lot to do with, because I got involved in accreditation systems and all that kind of thing, and running qualification programs and that sort of stuff. And I think it's been a really interesting journey. I originally got into coaching off the back of being involved in, I was doing a lot around cross-cultural training. I was working in an international language school actually at the time, doing TEFL, TEFL teacher, and noticing how actually people needed something more than a training approach. So it's very, very simple, humble beginnings of just kind of trying something out. I read, I think, half of John Whitmore's book and thought, I'll set up a coaching program in my workplace. And interestingly, this kind of speaks to dialogue, because nobody had ever told me that it should always be one-to-one. Yeah. So I just intuited that actually if I got two, because I was a director of studies, if I got two teachers that were pretty much kind of at the same sort of level of experience, expertise, we might work as a kind of dyadic coaching. And it was really successful, I think. When I look back, I think there was so much that came out of that kind of peer exploration.
So using the GROW model?
I don't think I probably did. I think we just sort of made it up as we went along. Yeah. But it was just really like, so what do you want to focus on? It was all professionally framed, I must admit, so it was around kind of core teaching skills and that kind of thing. Yeah. But I think there was something even in that, is like there's some, what happens in dialogue is something else suddenly starts morphing out of the conversation. And so looking back at that, it was nice because it wasn't team coaching. It wasn't trying to get them to work together and like each other or anything like that. It was just learning, and exploring things. And so it was pretty powerful. But so that's kind of, it's been about 20 years ago since I first dipped my toes into coaching, and I'm still here.
So was the change into, I don't know if you'd call it that, but was it how gradual was it? So we're going to talk about the wisdom of self-healing systems, hopefully. I don't want to leap to that. So What went in between, if anything?
Oh gosh, I think I've always been interested in what's at the margins, and that I can hypothesize as to why that might be. I mean, one reason might be I spent the first half of my life, not first half, but my up until my 20s, I was quite close to Japan. My parents still lived there, so it was still home, and I spent a lot of my growing up years there, and then sort of ended up, traveling quite a lot. So I feel as though, this sort of sense of there's this idea that there's a kind of a shared view on things, or kind of common knowledge. I think I've always fought against that to some extent. It's kind of like, but it isn't, or kind of always finding a bit, looking for the exception. So I know that that's part of my character trait, which can be a little bit kind of annoying sometimes, but
yeah, I can relate to that.
But that always then makes you go to the edges and think, well, what else could happen here? What else is possible? And I think that mixture of kind of an east-west thinking, I never really fully realized how much of kind of Asia and Japan I actually had absorbed in me until I was at a coaching conference in Korea probably about 10 years ago now. And I had this kind of revelation of like, how come even if I'm amongst all these people I don't know, it somehow feels easier to be me here than it is back in the UK. And it was kind of like this sort of, okay, bit of an insight, and also, just learning and sharing with other people, contemporaries who had a similar experience to me in terms of being growing up in Asia and then being back in the UK, and sort of realizing it really does shape you. And I think that holding a sort of yin yang, east west perspective is, probably has had quite a bit to do with shaping my direction.
And I suspect that lends itself to being a facilitator and being able to be detached from what's going on and have that objectivity as well. Does it, being in a different culture for so long?
Maybe, because I think you do, there's a phenomenon of third culture kid, which is people who grew up in a country that was different to their parents' passport country, and then the third culture is actually the culture of people with that shared experience. And I think you do quite a bit of observation, because it's always trying to figure out how to fit in. Which obviously is not just an experience of people that have lived in another country, but anybody, in neurodiversity as well, the same kind of thing of like having to read the signals and kind of think, how do you need to speak, how do you need to connect with people to somehow fit in, and then you get to a point of acceptance as well that that's probably never going to happen.
I love that.
I love that way.
No, that's really great.
Desirable,
Sorry, say again.
Or is it even desirable to try and assimilate?
And thanks for bridging it into that. And I feel a connection, and that's that, like I say, that's why I reached out to you, to feel this connection, this understanding of the periphery. And personally I've gone through that. Do I really want to be normal? A lot of people do, but we have pressure to conform and everything. Just getting back to things you've said to me, or you've said somewhere, I've got a quote here: often the greatest stretch is to connect with our own greatness, humility and compassion, an experience which can be profound and deeply challenging. I think that's 2012, so a long time ago, so it wasn't to me. I think that might relate to what you were just talking about.
I think there is something, I think a lot, I'm not unique in this, a lot of coaches, I think, as they go through their journey into authenticity and into compassion, it's like, and some of these stages have been described, haven't they, from sort of a more kind of competence and skills based, into something else, which is about your capacity to really hold space for someone else. But in doing so, you're having to really connect to your own evolving self, let's say, in a compassionate way, to kind of own that, I think.
Yeah.
Own in perhaps a kind of light way, but yeah, and I think that is challenging.
Yeah, because and I'm just looking at something else you did say to me, and that was about embodied compassion. I suppose that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and this piece around embodiment, which I think is maybe a bridge into this wisdom of self-healing systems. I think that is a really core element to my own growth and learning, to feel that I could bring my embodied knowing and embodied self, if you like, into my work in whatever shape or form that took, and that I could also support others to connect to their own knowing. And the modality that I trained in and that I use is called focusing. It came from Eugene Gendlin's work, and by focusing, always have to kind of do a little explanation. It's not like narrow focusing. It's like, well, what emerges, what comes into focus when we stay with our embodied sensing, experiencing, and allowing that kind of powerful knowing to surface. And I suppose I've always felt there are so many things that happen in life, messaging in education, cultural and societal conditioning, that gets us to not trust our bodies.
Yeah. And that can be quite, as you say, challenging, but quite a scary place for a lot of people as well. Yes.
Yeah. So it's, can I trust my own experience? Or maybe trust is too strong. Maybe it's like, do I even believe that my own experience has something, what I'm experiencing has something valuable to say to me? It doesn't have to be the truth, but it's data information that's really could be really useful. And I think we've become, and I dare I say, in the last couple of years, I think it's dialed it up for people, because apart from anything else, we're physically separated from each other. We're working through screens like this. We've kind of almost been conditioned to think of kind of this kind of constant fear of illness and disease, I think, as well, is not helpful to learning to trust the body and listen to it. So the messaging, I think, that we've adopted, whatever your position stances, I think we can probably agree that that we've been swimming in this kind of whole societal kind of messaging, and yeah, so I feel there's something quite precious that's worth fighting for. Might be the wrong language, I don't know. Or maybe not.
Yeah, it gets very complex, doesn't it, when we're talking about global pandemics? And before you came on to that, I was thinking about asking about systems and the quantum aspect as well, but I don't know, we could end up going down quite a deep rabbit hole in a short space of time.
And just also, I should mention for your viewers or whatever, I've got a couple of flies that keep buzzing around. If they do, that's thanks to the fact that I've got I try to be as sort of permaculture as possible, even in my small little flat.
Yeah.
So there's a little compost bin outside, and sometimes when the windows are open, they come and pay visit. So
yeah, well, it adds a bit of energy and
welcoming them in.
Yeah, adds a bit of extra life to the picture.
That's true.
Yeah. So let's touch a little bit upon the wisdom of self-healing, because I'm intrigued how this is going to unfold. in relation to neurodiversity and neurodiversity as part of biodiversity and pattern recognition and systems. And can you start by just saying what it is bringing regenerative principles to life?
Okay.
I love that. Whatever it means.
So you may well be aware that sort of within leadership and organizational discourse, this whole piece around organizations as living systems or applying living systems thinking is let's say a discourse that's been growing. There's quite a number of different I'm thinking of Simon Weston's book on leadership, where he talks about the sort of messianic leadership discourse is kind of waning, and we have the I think he called it the eco discourse. He talks about network leadership, and there are many other people who have been writing and talking kind of in this space. It really feels as though we're now it's not that difficult to go into an organization and use metaphors from forests and talk about mycorrhizal networks and stuff, because we recognize we are networked societally, and so these analogies, let's say, I think can be really helpful. And what I notice as well is maybe the language doesn't always help, but in borrowing from things like biomimicry, it's like biomimicry, so we're mimicking nature, but that already is language of separation because it's not acknowledging ourselves as nature. Of course, I know the biomimicry movement would be doing that, but it can be, we often end up in this kind of, well, let's use nature as a metaphor or something. Well, nature isn't a metaphor,
and we're not separate from it.
And we're not separate. So like, and my kind of observation is that actually we can go deeper with our regenerative thinking and what's sometimes called our kind of sense of deep ecology. And whilst the kind of machine model thinking paradigm, so machine and military model of organizations, is often, if something's broken, you fix it, but you fix machines, you don't. Living systems actually, to a large extent, have a capacity to renew and regenerate themselves. Sometimes maybe some external inputs can be useful from time to time, but largely, and this kind of comes to, perhaps some of the medical models that we're used to is like, you've got this, take this pill, take this drug or whatever. If there's an interaction, then take this, or we just kind of keep adding more and more, as opposed to what might the body be able to do for itself given the right conditions to heal itself. And I see that there are some core principles that I feel I've tapped into. I'm sure I'm not unique in that, but I've tried to go to a meta level, because obviously once you get into the world of healing, and I don't know how much you've probably dipped into various bits and pieces of it, but it's a really broad church, if you like, of all sorts of different philosophies from East and kind of Western herbal medicine and shamanic stuff and native stuff and etc. So you've got this whole mishmash of stuff going on, and I'm not trying to be I feel that we need to learn from that, and learn from kind of deep observation of how nature restores and regenerates, and then learn to kind of work with those principles. So working with those natural principles, if we can just understand them, realize that they often translate into very different formats depending on what particular tradition that you're kind of working with or used to. And so that's how the wisdom of self-healing systems emerged, which is really an opportunity for people who are looking to go deeper into this, to think, okay, so here are some pretty reliable, I think, principles that we could be actively kind of tapping into in the way that we look after ourselves or in our work or whatever it might be.
Okay. So would it be all right to just unpack what the is it a course, you call it a course program, unpack a little bit about the process for a typical new participant in this? Okay.
I start off with a bit of an introduction to the whole, because it's not a linear process as such. So we can sort of end up starting from anywhere, I guess. But the way that I try to introduce, I guess, some of the key concepts starts with an understanding of how nature and our reality is constructed, often in kind of fractal forms and fractal patterns. So we think about, you know, how we see these repeating patterns, and like actually, so that means we can look at something very small and understand something that may be working at other levels and scales of systems. So we go into that and we see how that actually works in nature, and there's a kind of a sense of learning to trust that. I think that's really important. So when we see, okay, so this is how so much of what we see is probably everything, I don't know, but, you know, it's constructed. We think about, you know, sacred geometry and all these different sequences that keep playing out. Then we could observe how healing happens at one level of system and learn to observe that and understand how that might play out in different contexts. So that's one key aspect. And then from that, recognizing that healing is process oriented. So and it often starts with inflammation.
Inflammation.
Yeah, starts with something telling us that something's wrong. Yeah.
Okay.
And that is actually the start of the healing process happening. Yep. So often what we do is we try and squelch the inflammation and the pain so that we're not actually taking in the messages of that something's wrong. Yeah. So we're just kind of storing it up for another time, kind of thing, or training ourselves not to really listen to the body, whether it's our body or a social body, an organizational body. And I think also we're tapping into the idea that healing is different from like a quick cure. Like, I'm not saying that cure, you know, things don't cure as such, but you know, somebody might be suffering from a you know, terminal illness, and they may experience healing, but not necessarily a cure. So, you know, there might be aspects of their health where they experience healing, or they might experience relational healing. That means that they can end well, you know, and their family system will be able to heal better from the loss of that individual. Yeah. Or they might experience a cure but no healing. Yeah. And you know, so our understanding of healing is pretty important in this, and sort of like how we frame our expectations, and to recognize that actually an ending or a death might also just be part of what needs to happen. Yeah, which is kind of hard to talk about in today's world, but you know, just kind of like, do we have an acceptance that, you know, death and endings do happen as well? But how can that be part of nurturing, you know, what's next, and kind of, you know, the new? And nature does that so beautifully. So when we're in a forest, we don't think, oh my God, how are new plants going to grow here? Because the trees do it naturally themselves. When, you know, they die and they create a bit more space, and then the nutrients go into the soil, and, you know, but so often in organizations we're like, well, how are we going to, you know, we've got this and we've got this, and we can't see that there could be a positive relationship between something that maybe could, you know, resource the new that needs to happen.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's just reminds me of when you mentioned intervention earlier. Intervention, it's like language itself is wrought with problems, and we think of an intervention or a cure as the be all and end all, but it's actually, if you're working with the system, just like complementary medicine is complementary, we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but this whole approach to I think it's like what you're explaining is like accepting the huge diversity of modalities of regenerating systems. I get it now.
Okay.
And yeah, I think I get it, and I think I want to sign up. Yeah, it sounds exciting. So what kind of people are, is it quite new? Have you run many, and what kind of people are coming? Are they leaders? Are they people that need therapeutic work?
So I ran this originally back at the beginning of 2020 as a bit of a favor for an organization called Hawkwood College that was having to move everything online. And so I just thought, wow, wisdom of self-healing systems, like, shall we do something around that? I didn't even know what it was, you know.
Yeah.
So we just said, that sounds like a good title. And
I know that feeling.
So we just, you know, just ran something with their members, and we had about 30 people on the call. You know, it's like a month-long thing, I think it was. And it felt to me right then that, oh, there's something really rich here, and that it, you know, so I spent probably, you know, next year and a half or so just kind of sensing into that and sensing more deeply and doing my own kind of observation around how these principles, and I mean, I only went through the fractal bit and the process bit, but there's other aspects that kind of just naturally flow out of that, and we can talk about that another time. But it's like, oh, okay, so you know, observing how I could introduce this into my coaching work and the kind of shifts and changes that seem to happen as a result. And so, yeah, the current program, I guess you attract who's kind of in your network, don't you, when you first start these things. So they are largely seasoned coaches and supervisors, so people working, you know, who've been working with change and dialogue, I think, you know, really for quite a long time. So I'm very blessed actually to have a really sophisticated group of people. But my intention is that actually, you know, that it could be adapted to leaders. It could be, you know, it can be sort of perhaps made a bit more. I always have a danger of going a little bit conceptual if I'm not careful. So how to make it just really land for people and like make it really practical tools, I think is probably a next step.
Yeah, and for your own process, being an agent of change, being open to whatever's coming towards you, and feeling, I suppose the focusing helps a little bit of that, feeling what's right for you. It's a little bit shamanic in a way.
Yeah, I mean, like, what interesting to consider, you know, that society's always had people who've chosen or ended up kind of being on those margins, and I don't suppose that's that kind of function of like being a sort of a placeholder on the margins, you know, that there are people who are sitting there, and maybe we don't always get the kind of teaching that we need about how to do that well.
Yeah,
you know, like we don't, where's the lineage coming from, or where's the, you know, so we're having to discover that ourselves, and through relationship, and you know, whether you want to call it shamanic or not, I think it's just like, oh, okay, but it's playing this role, sometimes a bit uncomfortable, misunderstood. You know, you can pull your hair out some days and think, why God, why?
Yeah. Absolutely.
But, you know, there we are.
And I suppose starting to round this up, but just talking about the Dialogue Village and my work in autism. What's a really nice link with Laurie Hogenkamp, who's a researcher who's come up with a theory of autism for stress it's the stress adaptation theory, and really, can't pretend to understand it very well, but what I'm getting is that in more traditional communities and villages, there were the predominant neurotype that would keep, their job was to keep the community on the even keel and status quo and keep it safe. But around that, she calls it the peripheral minds of autism, and the whole idea is that there are still, autistic people have adapted to having to try and conform, because we're not living traditionally, we're not living with the whole system and in modern societies. So a lot of those unusual neurodivergent minds that are there in a whole sense to give life and new ideas and creativity and unusual, inventive, outside the box, etc. But because of the pressure to conform, that's what's making mental health difficulties.
Okay.
And
So I think I need to try and set up a podcast where I interview you, because it feels like there's a part 2 to this conversation, which I'd love to hear more about what you're sharing there, because it does feel like there's a huge amount of congruence with what I've been noticing.
And I mean, that's the whole idea for Dialogue Village and this podcast. It was like me with the words autism dialogue just popped into my head. I thought, oh, well, that sounds good. What's that about? So it was just try it, suck it and see. And here we are 5 years later. And I've been racking my brains for about a year thinking, probably more than that, how are we going to spread it? We need to train facilitators, etc., etc. There's a lot of big questions, but the online Dialogue Village community hub online is providing a little bit of a focus point, and this is part of that. But I was wanting to talk a bit more about neurodiversity. Maybe I could just ask you one last question.
Sure.
And what do you think about the concept of neurodiversity? I'll just give you a bit of a steer. Judy Singer said, it's a state of nature to be respected. It's an analytical tool for examining social issues. It's an argument for the conservation and facilitation of human diversity. And it's a term that refers to an obvious and indisputable feature of Earth's biosphere. It's just absolutely fascinating as an emerging concept.
What it brings up for me is in an era of people being deplatformed for all sorts of reasons, are sort of like, this is the way to think about things, this is the line. And actually, when we look at neurodiversity, and I guess even that word gets you, neurodivergent kind of means a certain thing, but actually we're all neurodivergent on a spectrum of all the different ways that you can think, which is also culturally informed as well. And actually we're at a time where we need all those voices. We need all of those different perspectives. We can't do without them to be sustainable, to thrive. And so I can't think of a more important time for you to be doing this work.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it just seems more obvious as time goes on that what is autism as a social construct. For example, I mean, it's a fantastic catalyst because the word, it means self. You talk about crisis of communication and loss of selfhood, but that's going down another avenue. It just feels like it's something that everybody is invested in, needs to be invested in, but because it's something that is here that we need to look at together. What is it? Basically, I say, what is it? What's autism? That's the first dialogue, what is it to you? And let's unpack that.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's been really great. Yeah, thank you.
We'll have another conversation sometime then. And
yeah, it'd be good to. Part B.
Yeah, great. Cue the music.